Right, so what I'm going to attempt to do now is talk about various parts of areas of the brain, their functions, and what happens if they have lesions or are destroyed or in any way, or have disorder, or what the potential disorders are. So we're going to start with the cerebellum, which is known as the little brain. So your little brain. And it is located in the posterior cranial fossa, which is the fancy way of saying the back of your head. And it is responsible for controlling timings and forces of contraction, so muscle contractions. So timings and forces of contraction. Okay. So highly to do with what's the word? Coordination. That's the one. So timings and forces of contraction, and this is voluntary muscles. So voluntary muscles, and it is the cerebellum's job to give us a smooth movement. Smooth movements. Okay. And if we have lesions of the cerebellum, what are we going to get? So lesions could result in lots of dis words. Actually, let's start with not a dis word. We'll start with ataxia. Now, ataxia is an umbrella term for disorders affecting coordination. And some of the dis words. So we've got dysnergia, or dysnergia. Or dysynergia, sorry. Dysynergia. And this is disturbance of muscular coordination. Ooh, oh dear, hello. Tipped over me, dude. Oh no, disaster. What's going on? Oh no, hang on. Oh, there, we'll try that again. So we said muscle coordination disturbances. Our next dis word is dysmetria. Dysmetria. And this is impaired coordination in terms of overshooting or undershooting. Over or undershooting. So undershooting. So this should start ringing bells with our cerebellar tests that we did for that exam. Okay, the next one, this is going to be fun, is dysdiadochokinesia. Kinesia. Dysdiadochokinesia. And this is an inability to perform rapid alternating movements. So inability for rapid alternating movements. So this should be ringing bells with the cerebellar testing in the practical exam. And then we'll finish with dysarthria. Dysarthria. And this is difficulty articulating speech, which would otherwise be normal. So there's nothing wrong with the words that the person is saying, but it's the speech. So problems with articulation of speech. Okay, and that is your cerebellum. Right, so next we have our frontal lobe. So, what have we got in our frontal lobe? We have got a high concentration of motor neurons, or motor neurones. High concentration, we can write the whole word. High concentration of motor neurons. Oops. Of motor neurons. What else? So the primary motor cortex, which is part of the frontal lobe, is principally involved in motor function, and the primary motor cortex is located at the back of the frontal lobe. So our primary motor cortex is located at the back of the frontal lobe. We'll just put frontal lobe, there we go. So it's at the back of the frontal lobe, and it is next to the central sulcus. Next to the central sulcus. That's something that sulks in your brain. So what the central sulcus does, it separates the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe, and the primary motor cortex from the somatosensory cortex. So functions of the frontal lobe. Where are we? Let's get a nice little pen here. So, functions. Would be a number of functions. So your frontal lobe is to do with behaviour, emotion, judgment, memory, And this is your memory of motor habits. In fact, we can write that. Your memory of motor habits. What else? Planning. And that means organising movements. Organising movements as opposed to planning what you're going to wear to that party. And reasoning. Reasoning. There we go. So those are its functions. Give some bullet points. I like a bullet point. So, let's talk a bit about that. So the frontal lobe is responsible for planning and movements, which start right at the front of the lobe. So that's where the planning happens. And then that progresses backwards. As you process that information, it progresses backwards. And then you make the action or movement. So the frontal lobe is also responsible for understanding the consequences of our actions. So something that says a lot in Buddhism is actions have consequences. And your frontal lobe will tell you all about that. So let's talk about disorders or lesions. So disorders, lesions. What have we got? What have we got? So, really important actually is primitive reflexes. So you have primitive reflexes as a baby, and as you grow, the frontal lobe suppresses those primitive reflexes. So that's your Babinski reflex, Gallant reflex, and Moro reflexes. So if you have a frontal lobe injury, that can you can regain those primitive reflexes. So primitive reflexes. What else? So your frontal lobe is also responsible for broker speech. So broker, this is really important. Broker speech, which is word production. I'm going to write that because it's really, really important. Word production. So that could be when you have broker's aphasia or non-fluent aphasia. So you can't produce language, but you can comprehend it. So maybe you can't speak, you can't get the words out. So you can't formulate the words in order to speak, although you can understand what people are saying to you. Some other causes of disorders or issues if there are lesions. So we can have contralateral paralysis. Contralateral paralysis. Motor apraxia. Motor apraxia. Impaired concentration. impaired concentration, unstable emotions. So this isn't just to do with being on your period and being a bit wonky. So unstable emotions and unacceptable behaviour. So reasoning. Unacceptable behaviour. Okay, so that's plenty to be getting on with. Another one I could put in there if I had more space would be conjugate gaze paralysis, which is where you cannot move both your eyes in the same direction. Okay, so that's your disorders and lesions of the frontal lobe. So your parietal lobe, next up, we've got, what's it responsible for? What is your parietal lobe responsible for? So visual attention. Visual attention. Somatic sensation. Taste. Maths. My God, my parietal lobe must be knackered. Gosh, you've got a number of things for your parietal lobe, plenty of stuff. So touch perception. Touch perception. Association. Naming objects. Naming objects. And goal-directed movements. That's an important one. Goal-directed movements. Goal-directed movements. Okay. And if we should have lesions in the parietal lobe, so lesions, what can this cause? So contralateral anesthesia. Contralateral anesthesia. What else? Impaired taste, which is not a terrible thing if you eat my cooking. Inability to interpret visual information. Inability to interpret. Visual information. Also, inability to name objects. And then inability to do simple maths. So if we think about the things it can do, if you've got a lesion, it's not going to be able to do those things. Right, so then we've got the occipital lobe. The occipital lobe. So the occipital lobe is very well connected with vision. So it's the smallest lobe. Just for trivia's sake. And it is to do with vision. So it's the visual processing centre of the brain. Right, so very simply, lesions. What's going to occur with lesions? Right, where's my bullet point button? Right, there we go. Right, so we've got what's called colour agnosia or agnosia. Oh, that's the wrong colour pen. God, that was fitting. Colour agnosia. So you cannot properly recognise or discern colours. So colour agnosia. Or you can only see one side of the visual world. So only one side of the visual world. So what this means is your eyes are actually fine. Nothing wrong with your eyes. It's the brain. The brain is disordered with this one. So another couple of issues we could have is word blindness. Word blindness. Difficulty locating objects. Difficulty locating objects. And hallucinations. Potential hallucinations. Hallucinations. So you get hit over the back of the head, you see stars. Your occipital lobe has taken a blow. All right, and then we've got our temporal lobe. So what's this responsible for? Hearing. It's around the side of your head. That's where your ears are. Memory acquisition. A little bit of vision. Just a little. Don't get carried away. Categorizing objects. Categorizing objects. Right, and a really, really important one, this is very, very important, is called Wernicke's speech. So, which is language understanding and formation. Excuse me. So I'm going to write this out long because it's really important. Language understanding and formation. And I'm just going to write that in a different colour here. This is called Wernicke's speech. Very important, which I will tell you why in a minute. So, if we have lesions or disorders, in this lobe. So we'll go for, firstly, since it's to do with Wernicke's speech, we'll go for Wernicke's aphasia. Really, really important. Wernicke's aphasia. So, this is where the person is speaking fluently. They're speaking fluent words, but they don't make sense. The sentences don't make sense. Or they'll put nonsensical words into an otherwise normal sentence. So, let's just put nonsensical words and fluent but make no sense. Okay, so that's Wernicke's aphasia. Another one we've got is, so deep within the temporal lobe, we have what's called the fusiform gyrus, which recognises faces. Inability to recognise faces, and this is damage to the fusiform gyrus. Right, so those are two biggies in that one. And we are just going to finish on just a little bit about strokes, since it's in the same bit that I'm reading from. So let's have a look. So strokes, they can affect any area of the brain. Any area of the brain. We have got a CVA. What's that? So, a cerebrovascular accident. And what's this? So, cerebrovascular accident results in brain damage. So, brain damage, and as a result, you will lose functions. You will lose some of your functions. And then we've got what's called a TIA. TIA, transient ischemic attack. Transient ischemic attack. So otherwise known as mini strokes. And the symptoms last up to 24 hours. However, so they are often a precursor for something bigger. Something bigger. So So that's your TIAs. And I believe that is it for this vid. Yep, so there we go. A little bit about the cerebellum, the frontal, parietal, occipital and temporal lobes, and a little bit about strokes.